this episode, we move from building hardened baselines to assessing real managed application services for misconfigurations, because even with good standards, real environments drift. Managed application services are attractive targets because they sit at the center of business activity. They often have direct access to data and other services, and they can be exposed to the internet by design. Attackers tend to exploit the same categories of misconfiguration repeatedly, not because they are creative, but because these mistakes are common and high impact. Assessment, in this context, means looking at a service and deciding whether it matches the intended security posture, whether it is exposed more broadly than necessary, and whether its identity and integrations are scoped properly. The beginner goal is to learn how to think like an assessor without diving into tool-specific scanning or configuration steps. You want a repeatable mental checklist that helps you notice the misconfigurations attackers look for first, understand why they are dangerous, and recognize the signals that a service is likely out of alignment with secure design. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good starting point is to remember that attackers prioritize speed and certainty, so they go after misconfigurations that create easy entry points or easy privilege expansion. In managed application services, that often means anything that weakens authentication, broadens network reachability, or grants overly powerful permissions to the running service identity. Another high-value category is anything that leaks information, such as verbose error output or publicly accessible diagnostic endpoints, because information makes later attacks easier. Attackers also love misconfigurations that are durable, meaning they persist silently over time, because those give them repeated opportunities to find and exploit them. When you assess a service, you want to focus first on the misconfigurations that combine high impact and high likelihood. Beginners should recognize that you do not have to catch every obscure edge case to reduce most risk. You have to catch the common failures that open big doors. That is why we focus on what attackers exploit first. Network exposure is usually the first assessment area because it defines who can even attempt to interact with the service. A common misconfiguration is exposing a service publicly when it was meant to be internal, such as an internal API or an administrative interface that should never be internet-facing. Another common misconfiguration is leaving management endpoints or debug features reachable through the same public path as user traffic, which expands the attack surface. Even when a service must be public, misconfigurations can include overly broad reachability without constraints, such as allowing access from anywhere when business needs would allow restriction to known consumers or known regions. An assessor mindset asks simple questions. Is the service reachable from the internet? Should it be? And if it must be, is the exposed surface minimized? It also asks whether internal dependencies are kept private, because a common architecture mistake is making everything public for simplicity. Beginners should internalize that reachability is a risk amplifier, because any authentication or authorization weakness becomes more dangerous when anyone can probe it. Authentication and session handling are next because managed services often integrate with identity systems, and misconfigurations here can make unauthorized access much easier. Common problems include allowing weak authentication methods, failing to enforce multi-factor authentication for administrative actions, or relying on shared credentials for service access. Another frequent issue is failing to require re-authentication for sensitive operations, which can make session theft more damaging. Misconfigurations can also include allowing anonymous access to endpoints that were assumed to be protected, which might happen through default routes or misapplied access rules. In an assessment, you want to confirm that the service is not only protected by a login screen, but protected in a way that resists common attacks like credential stuffing, token theft, and phishing-driven approval. Beginners should notice that authentication problems are often subtle, because a system can appear to require login while still allowing bypass paths. That is why assessment focuses on verifying assumptions rather than trusting surface appearances. Authorization and permissions are a huge area for managed application services because these services often run with an identity that can call other cloud services. One of the most exploited misconfigurations is over-permissioned identities, where the application's identity can read or write far more than it needs. This is dangerous because if the application is compromised, the attacker inherits those permissions and can quickly pivot to storage, databases, messaging systems, and management functions. Over-permissioning also makes accidental damage more likely, because a bug or misrouted request can affect more resources than intended. Another misconfiguration is using a single powerful identity for multiple services, which increases blast radius and reduces accountability. Assessment here is about mapping what the service should access and comparing it to what it can access. Beginners should remember that least privilege is not an abstract ideal. It is the difference between a compromised web service being limited to its own data versus being able to sweep across the environment. Configuration and feature exposure are another common category because managed services often provide convenience features that are useful in development but risky in production. Debug modes, diagnostic endpoints, remote consoles, and overly detailed error responses can all leak information or create entry points. A service might expose runtime metadata, environment details, or configuration values that an attacker can use for targeted exploitation. Misconfigurations here often arise from environment drift, where a team enables a feature temporarily to troubleshoot and then forgets to disable it. Assessment means looking for features that increase exposure and asking whether they are necessary in the current environment. It also means checking whether administrative features are separated from user-facing features, because mixing them makes it easier for attackers to reach privileged functionality. Beginners should take away that convenience features are not inherently bad, but they must be treated as controlled exceptions, not normal production posture. Logging and monitoring misconfigurations are also high priority because attackers exploit blind spots. A managed service might be running securely, but if logging is incomplete or inconsistent, an attacker can probe and test without triggering meaningful detection. A common failure is not capturing access logs, not retaining logs long enough, or not correlating service events with identity and network context. Another failure is logging too much sensitive information, such as secrets or personal data, which creates a different kind of exposure. Assessment asks whether you can reconstruct who accessed the service, what they did, and how the service behaved during a suspicious window. It also asks whether abnormal patterns would stand out, such as traffic spikes, repeated authentication failures, or unusual administrative actions. Beginners should notice that attackers do not just look for ways in. They also look for places where they can operate quietly. Logging discipline is what denies them that quietness. Change and deployment practices can create misconfigurations that attackers exploit because managed services are often updated frequently. If configuration changes are made directly and informally, they can introduce drift that is hard to track and easy to overlook. If a team copies an example configuration that is permissive, that permissiveness can propagate across multiple services. If environments are not separated well, a misconfiguration in development can leak into production. Assessment here focuses on whether the service's configuration is stable, whether changes are traceable, and whether there is a process to detect drift from the hardened baseline. Attackers exploit the gaps created by rapid change, because rapid change creates mistakes, and mistakes create openings. For beginners, the takeaway is that security is not only about the settings you have today, it is also about how reliably you can keep those settings aligned tomorrow after many changes. Another important assessment angle is data exposure through application behavior, because even if the platform settings are correct, the service might leak data through responses, caching, or integration patterns. For example, an application might return too much information in responses, expose sensitive data in error messages, or allow broad data queries without proper authorization checks. While these are partly application design issues, managed services can amplify them if they are exposed broadly or integrated with powerful identities. Assessment connects platform posture to application risk by asking whether the service's data interactions match the principle of minimum exposure. If the service can return sensitive data, then access controls must be strong and monitoring must be strong, because the service is a direct exfiltration path. Beginners should see that platform assessment and application assessment are linked because attackers do not care whether a weakness is called platform or application. They care whether it yields data or control. When you bring these pieces together, assessing managed application services for misconfigurations attackers exploit first becomes a structured way of verifying exposure, identity power, feature safety, and visibility. You start with reachability because it defines who can try, and you confirm that public exposure exists only where it is intended and minimized. You examine authentication assumptions and ensure sessions and administrative actions require strong proof. You focus heavily on authorization and least privilege because over-permissioned identities are one of the fastest paths from one compromised service to broad cloud compromise. You look for risky convenience features that leak information or expose privileged functionality, especially those that tend to linger after troubleshooting. You verify logging and monitoring because blind spots invite attackers to operate quietly, and you ensure logs are both useful and not leaking sensitive content. You consider change practices and drift because misconfigurations often appear through routine updates rather than one-time errors. The practical outcome is an assessor mindset that spots the common doors attackers pull on first, which helps you prioritize fixes that deliver the largest risk reduction quickly before those weaknesses become the easy entry points that drive real incidents.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.